Visigoths have breached the walls of Rome. The Eternal City has been sacked for the first time since the Celts in 390 BC, 800 years earlier. The once great empire was collapsing into nothing. The Roman military was a shadow of its former self. Corruption ran the government, and in 476 AD, Romulus Augustus, the last puppet emperor of the West, was deposed. The Western Empire had fallen to barbarian tribes, mainly Germanic, between the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals, and it would never recover. Eastern attempts to retake the West had marginal success, but Rome would never be the same. The empire did not collapse due to one bad decision or one bad emperor. There were many causes for the demise and a wide variety of inept and incompetent emperors, but I believe 3 different emperors made drastic mistakes that led Rome to be doomed. Tiberius made a mistake that Caesar never did. He failed to crush, conquer, and subjugate the Germanic tribes to his north. Despite later mistakes by other emperors, this failure would be the ultimate demise of the entire Roman Empire, east and west. If Tiberius had used similar methods as Caesar did in Gaul, Rome's future may have been secured. He did have Germanicus lead 3 campaigns into the region, but pulled him out before he could complete the conquest. He then stationed him in Anatolia, far from his loyal legions. Germanicus mysteriously died a few years later, and he believed he was poisoned. Historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio believe it was done at Tiberius' orders, as he was afraid of Germanicus' growing power and popularity, and that Germanicus may eventually depose him. Nero was widely known as one of Rome's worst emperors, but often for incorrect reasons. He was corrupt and evil, but this was the norm, not the exception. His main fault was his extravagant waste of money. While Rome burned under Nero, and there is some speculation that it was on his orders, there is a lack of concrete evidence. He did, however, waste tons of money on mega projects that were useless, and later emperors had to remove them. To fund these, he began minting more coins, which ruined the Roman currency and led to an endless cycle of inflation. These inflations were terrible for the empire in the short term, but also were one of the major causes that led to the later crisis of the 3rd century, which was disastrous for Rome. Caracalla made a critical mistake when he tried to fix the Roman economy. He allowed everyone to become Roman citizens that lived in Roman land. This would give Rome a massive new source of tax revenue, which was supposed to boost the economy. And while it sounded like a good idea, it had unforeseen consequences. This drastically limited the sizes of the military that the empire could draw upon. The previous way that people could become citizens was through serving in the military for 25 years. After their service had been concluded, they had all the privileges of being a citizen. They could vote in elections and assemblies, own and inherit property, travel freely throughout the empire. You would never be crucified, and you had immunity to some local laws. You would also be treated far better by Roman authorities if you were a Roman citizen. This process led many to becoming fiercely loyal to the empire, despite having been previously conquered by Rome. When Caracalla removed this, Rome's military never saw the same heights and were constantly fighting larger barbarian forces and were always undermanned. This was the last major reason for the fall of Rome, the lack of Roman military. In 256 BC at the Battle of Cape Agnomus, Rome was able to field 140,000 men. This was during the First Punic War, when Rome had a population of around 5 to 7 million people, and throughout the war they were able to field almost 700,000 men to fight Carthage. Hundreds of years later, under Emperor Constantine, with a population of 55 million people or more, Rome's entire standing military was only 645,000 men, despite having a population 10 times what they previously had 600 years earlier. The last great Roman victory came against the Huns, and this was the last stand for Rome. The Roman general Aetius was able to fight off a force of 200,000 barbarians at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, where Aetius was able to gather around 30,000 Romans and about 20,000 Germanic allies to fight off this massive Hunnic invasion. This goes to show, despite the misconceptions, the late Roman Empire and their army was still far superior to barbarian counterparts. They just simply, over time, ran out of men to fight back. In order for Rome to be saved, we need to go back all the way to 3 AD, where Lucius Caesar, the second heir of Augustus, had passed away. This led to some turmoil, as Augustus had originally planned for two separate emperors, but his chosen heir, Gaius Caesar, was alive, until he similarly passed away 1 year later while campaigning in Armenia. Augustus now had no heirs, so his new two choices were Tiberius and Germanicus. In the real world, Augustus went with Tiberius, his adopted son, but now he goes with Germanicus, his grandnephew, the 19-year-old golden boy of Rome. Tiberius stayed in Rhodes and did not involve himself in politics in our timeline, and faded into obscurity. Germanicus's heir would be his younger brother Claudius, until he had any sons of his own. The Illyrian War would still break out in our timeline, as the two Illyrian generals, both named Bato, originally raided the surrounding landscapes before Augustus sent word to Severus, who was stationed in Thrace, and Germanicus in the north. Severus was able to beat Bato back, and he fled and reunited with the other Bato before Germanicus crushed them in a decisive victory, effectively ending the war. Severus returned to Thrace, and Germanicus went to Rome, where he received a triumph. After his triumph, Rome received word of the fatal battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where Varus lost 3 legions to the Germanic tribes under Arminius. Augustus sent Germanicus and Claudius to Germania to raid the tribes with 4 legions. He was aided by the Marcomannic tribes under the leadership of Marbodus. Germanicus spent the next 3 years ravaging the troublesome tribes, but Augustus did not want to expand into the land. In 13 AD, Germanicus was given full control of 8 legions, roughly 1/3 of Rome's total military. 1 year later, Augustus Caesar, Rome's greatest ever man, had passed away. Germanicus began the journey back to Rome, where he was crowned, and he stayed there for about 6 months. Claudius was boosted with 4 additional legions, totaling now 12, a strength of roughly 75,000 men. Germanicus returned to the Rhine and began a planned invasion of Germania. Claudius would take 6 legions and crush the northern tribes, while Germanicus would take 6 and crush the southern tribes. Germanicus spent the first year destroying the small German forces and burning all the villages. Claudius did the same in the north. Arminius spent the year gathering support to help boost his numbers, but in the meantime, almost all his allies in the west had been completely eliminated. Feeling desperate, he sent 2 small armies to fight to split Roman forces, but they were rebuffed. In the following spring, Germanicus and Claudius descended on Cherusci land. The battle proved to be a decisive Roman victory, with almost 50,000 dead German warriors. Arminius had managed to escape though, but Germanicus and Claudius ransacked all German villages there, with none left alive and no trace of them ever existing. Despite Arminius' escape to Vandal land, they sent him in chains to Germanicus as a sign of goodwill. In the meantime, Germanicus had 3 legions reinforce him and Claudius to make up for the dead Roman soldiers. He then sent word to the various Germanic tribes that they could either submit to Roman rule or be destroyed. They then spent the next 3 years campaigning, fighting various German armies and crushing all who opposed them. The Vandals proved to be worthy allies as Germanicus crushed the Burgundians in the last major wars. The Lugi tribes were the last to fall, and Germanicus wanted this to be one final message to the German people. Rome was here and here to stay. All Lugis were killed or sold into slavery. None were left, women or children. 400,000 Germans had been slain following the wars, and Germanicus began planning a finalized border along the Vistula River and plans to eventually conquer Dacia and set along the Carpathian mountain range. In the meantime, Germanicus sent many Germans to reinforce his soldiers far throughout the empire, and Claudius was sent to crush the last major Germanic rebellion. This was formed by mainly Vandal and Burgundian tribesmen. Claudius was merciless and crushed them all completely. Following his victory, Claudius began marching west and eventually went into former Cherusci land, where he built a new city. Nero Caesar, Germanicus' son, came north to begin his political career, where him and Claudius were sent to gather the remaining enemy Germans and have them brought to Rome to be sold in the markets. Following the success of Nero and Claudius, Germanicus had Germania officially become a region of the empire, with some small cities being built to further integrate the empire. Following the triumph, Germanicus began pushing more money into the new region, with cities and forts being established. The city of Drusae was built and named after his father Drusus. He brought in over 3 million Roman plebs in an attempt to dilute the population and make it easier to subjugate. This proved to be successful, and it worked in a similar way as Gaul did hundreds of years earlier. As Drusae took off, eventually trade routes were established, and it proved to be a beneficial area for the empire. As the economy was flourishing, Germanicus, in 41 AD, began his planned invasions of both Galicia in the north and Dacia in the south. Germanicus had a bulk of the force, and his son Nero would begin the invasion of Galicia with a smaller force. Germanicus fought some minor battles, but eventually he did lose to Scaurlo in a minor war in 43 AD. Scaurlo chased him, and eventually they met again, where Germanicus utterly defeated him. By 45 AD, Germanicus and Nero had moved into Sarmigiza, and after a year-long siege, the city fell, and Dacia became Roman. As the economy began to flourish, in 53 AD, Germanicus sent his son, Nero Julius Caesar, north with a planned invasion of Scandia, or what the Romans called Scandinavia. After 5 years, the region was conquered, and it became very important to the Roman economy as many natural minerals and ores were found there. 3 new cities were built, and the city of Agrippina was named after his wife. Germanicus died in 71 AD. During his reign, he added 3 massive pieces of land, drastically decreased the poverty rate of Rome, and built many new cities. He also added many new people to the empire, which furthered the tax base. Germanicus was succeeded by his son Nero Julius Caesar, who reigned for 12 years. He built many new forts along the eastern frontier, which created many new jobs. He played a similar role to Hadrian in our own timeline, and following his reign, Rome had a standing army of over 1 million people, many of whom came from the northern new regions of the empire. He was succeeded by his son Britannicus, who in 86 AD had to crush the last major Germanic rebellion. The war lasted 3 years, with some minor victories for the Germans, and 1 Roman legion was wiped out, but eventually Rome prevailed and crushed the Germans. During his reign, Britannicus also saw the conquest of Britannia, which proved to be a valuable new land for the empire, and he also began weakening the power of local rulers and built tons of new roads, bridges, and overall infrastructure before he passed away in 103 AD. Britannicus was succeeded by his son Gaius Drusus, who only reigned for 2 years. He began phasing out local rulers and creating new senators for various barbarians to further integrate them. He was then succeeded by his son Vespasius, who started with a conquest of Hibernia. Following an unsuccessful attack by the Parthians on Arminius, Emperor Vespasius, in 104 AD, gathered an army of 20 legions strong with an invasion in mind for Parthia. He first set out for Edessa, where he crushed a small Parthian force and quickly captured the city. In the following year, he met King Azorius I and defeated him in battle. Azorius fled to Ecbatana to gather more troops. In the meantime, Vespasius captured the cities of Ctesiphon and eventually moved south to Babylon, where he, like his idol Alexander, entered the city with cheers. In the following year, Vespasius met Azorius in what would prove to be the fatal battle for the Middle East. Vespasius captured Azorius after the battle and sent him back to Rome. New Parthian generals proclaimed themselves to be the king. Vespasius had to return to Babylon as he had become sick, and in a few months he passed away. This led to some instability in the legions, but they proclaimed his son Romulus to be the new emperor. He then marched north to fight the pretended Mithridates and destroyed him. He then marched east and captured the city of Susa, ransacking it. He then sent word to Persepolis that if they murdered their pretender, he would spare them from a sacking. When he returned, he was poisoned by his own citizens, and his army then began to flee to the far east to the last pretender of the Parthian throne. Romulus marched into Persepolis and had a roaring applause. He then fought the last pretender, and this ended the Parthian reign. Parthia had effectively run under Roman control, and Romulus spent the next 4 years sending various armies out to subjugate and conquer the people. He then marched east to the last city Alexander had ever found, incorporating it fully into the empire, and it proved to be a valuable trade hub. As he was returning, the first Jewish revolt broke out. The revolt was utterly crushed, and Romulus made his way to Rome through Alexandria and then Pella, the former capital of Macedonia, where he rebuilt the city to be the new trade hub for Greece of the empire. When he returned to Rome, he had his triumph, and he received the title Victor Orbis, Conqueror of the World. In the years after the triumph, there was a growing belief among the Roman elite and aristocrats that the empire was potentially spread too thin and too large. They wanted the empire to be split in between 4 administrative zones, a Germanic, Latin, Greek, and Persian zones with individual consuls who would rule as mini emperors. They would all report to the emperor in Rome, but Romulus was not particularly fond of this, as he believed it would lead to the empire being split apart later down the line. In 132 AD, when the Bar Kokhba revolt broke out, he utterly crushed it and destroyed Jerusalem. He then split the Jewish population all throughout the empire, as Trajan had done in our own timeline. This gave Romulus the idea for potential reforms, which later became known as the Romulan reforms. He took many plebs from all throughout the empire and split them in faraway distant regions to suppress their culture. As they were disunified, rebellions and revolts could be easier to crush down on, as these people would be far smaller, and Latin and Roman culture and customs would be pushed down on these people. The unforeseen consequences was the Antonine Plague's breakout. The plague broke out an estimated 30 years earlier in this timeline than in the real one. An estimated 30 million people were dead, but it ended up being a minor blessing for the empire, as the newly scattered groups began looking on centralized Roman authority for aid. Eventually Romulus, after this, built new fortresses along the eastern frontier to solidify it and prevent it from marauding Indian and Scythian raiders. Eventually Romulus passed, and Rome continued on to its golden age. As the golden age of Rome continued to span, successive emperors saw Nabatea added, which proved to be valuable for trading on the Arabian Peninsula, the Crimean region, which united the last true Greek colonies to Rome in a further bind, and eventually the Caucasus Mountains, which proved to be a natural border for Rome, with new fortresses being added to further solidify the frontier in the northeast. Rome's borders now looked like this, with a series of defensive walls and fortresses spanning thousands of miles. The empire spanned from Norway to Pakistan. Over time, there would be some revolts scattered throughout the empire, but Rome's added stability and strength would see each of these completely fail. Unlike our own timeline, there never would be a Cyprian plague, as it is believed to have spread from the Gothic migrations, and they would have been wiped out hundreds of years earlier. Christianity would still rise in the Roman Empire, and it would actually be accelerated as the new stability and cities would be compounded with the new roads of Rome, and Christianity would spread from all major cities, and eventually by the 3rd century it would become the dominant religion. The last pagan emperor of Rome would be in the late 350s, and by then almost all Roman politicians and aristocrats had become Christian. The popularity of the religion plus the benefits of the afterlife would be very beneficial for the spread. Similarly to our own timeline, there would be many patriarchs and bishops spread all throughout the empire, but the Pope would still grow to be the head of the church, as his position in Rome gave him prominent political power and an ear to the emperor. If any bishops or patriarchs tried to create a schism, the growing authority and the relationship with the emperor would prove to be valuable, as he would simply be removed from power and would never see a schismatic group. Christianity would spread beyond the empire and would prove to be a valuable cultural tool for Rome, as Christianity would spread into the Rus and Indians, and Christianity would become a much more global religion. Despite the widespread of Christianity and the centralization of the empire, there would be many forms, and you would see different sects and rites. However, they would still all be under the Pope. Rome's first great test would be during the 4th century with the emergence of the Huns. This would lead to a conflict that would span over 50 years, but would culminate in hundreds of thousands of Huns being slain by Rome, and they would be almost completely obliterated. Rome's great defenses had proven valuable. Rome's next great threat would occur in the 7th century with the expansion of the Muslim caliphates. Khalid ibn al-Walid would march north with his 20,000 troops but would be obliterated by the Roman general Videntis. Videntis had almost 60,000 men stationed in the area, and this would put a halt on Muslim expansion. In the next 100 years, you would see various Muslim attacks on Rome, but these would all be obliterated. Following these, the Pope would call for the first ever Roman crusade. Roman Emperor Aeroplane would bring a force of almost 300,000 Romans, the largest force ever assembled, and march into Arabia. He would put city after city to sack, and with the goal of crushing the Muslim invaders. Eventually he reached Mecca, where he sacked the city and obliterated it. No sign of it was left. Following this, the caliphate began to crumble and eventually dissolved. His last conquest solidified the Roman hold before he marched east. While east, he established the city of Aeroplane to further the trade network between the Indies and Rome. He then returned to Jerusalem, re-establishing it as a major city for the empire, before returning to Rome to continue his rule. Over the next 100 years, Islam would be harshly clamped down on by the government and almost completely obliterated. As Christianity became the official religion of the peninsula, Arabia became the newest region of Rome. As time went on, Rome began to see other nations and cultures form surrounding the empire. Some chose to ally with Rome, while others ended up becoming rivals. When the Vikings discovered North America in the 10th century, word quickly traveled back to the emperor in Rome, and he sent out an initial exploration party to see what this landmass was, calling the initial island Atlantis. As it became apparent that these were two separate, entirely new continents, Rome quickly subjugated and conquered the entire landmasses over the next 250 years, building hundreds of new cities. These cities began to establish new trade routes, and the trade routes soon connected to the Old World. Rome saw an influx of many natural resources, such as gold, jewels, fur, timber. This led to a booming merchant class that pushed Rome to be on the brink of industrialization. However, Rome would not industrialize till their greatest ever threat of the Mongol horde from the east emerged. The Mongols initially pushed Rome back to the Zagros Mountains after a long and bloody war lasted 12 years. As the Mongol threat became more and more real, Emperor Constantius IV brought the largest ever Roman force in recorded history, 600,000 Romans being brought from all throughout the empire. The Mongol Wars were a long and bloody conflict that lasted over 20 years and saw hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. After the fighting, though, Rome emerged victorious, and Constantius marched his army into Mongol heartland and destroyed them. He eventually returned back to Rome, where he was given the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. Following the Mongol invasions, Rome would begin a process of industrialization in the mid-1450s. This would be down to two main factors. The empire wanted to strengthen their hold in the New World, while the growing merchant class wanted to reduce trade times and increase their profits. As industrialization took place, Rome would be hundreds of years farther advanced than humanity in our own timeline. As Roman technology increased, Rome would begin a process of colonization and discovery in the Far East, taking command of Australia and the East Indies. This would lead to a massive intercontinental trade route that spanned 5 continents and led back to Rome. As the years rolled on, Rome continued to push their culture, religion, and military to the farthest reaches of humanity. Imperium aeternum vivere. The Eternal Empire lived on. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like the video, I thank you for sticking around so long. I will see you in the next one.